big thank you to all of you guys who showed up tonight. Tonight, we are starting out with a big question. Our big question is this. What do you do when you have been betrayed? And maybe some of you guys think of this word, betrayal, and you think, oh yeah, I've been betrayed before. I've been betrayed by my metabolism. We all showed up to college, and we thought, right now, this is what we think. We're like, oh, I'm 18 years old, like, I'm young, my body should be in peak shape, this metabolism not going to let me down. But then a semester and $400 worth of Chick-fil-A made you fix-a-lay, and now, 30 pounds later, you feel betrayed by your body. Maybe you have experienced betrayal. Or maybe you've been betrayed by one of those emails from like a Saudi Arabian prince who says, hey, if you send me your social security number and your credit card information, I'll give you $1,000. But instead you end up with identity theft and an empty bank account and you're betrayed. Also, P.S. freshmen, don't ever click on spam. Don't do it. Bad idea. What do you do? What do you do when you have been betrayed? Honestly, I feel like anyone who has siblings can probably relate. You probably have at least one that's a traitor, right? I have 5 siblings, and at least one of mine is both my best friend and my worst enemy. Now, growing up, my older brother Luke, he's 2 years older than me, he was pretty much every bit as squirrely as I was, and more often than not, we were getting in trouble together. But once in a blue moon, he would pull a fast one on me. And an example of this would be one time, we were kids and we were riding our bikes outside. And whenever we would ride our bikes outside, we had kind of a flat driveway. So we would build ramps or we would do tricks to try to make our bike ride seem like a little more dangerous. So one time, Luke had this bright idea. He was like, Lydia, you lay down on the driveway and I am going to ride my bike as close as I possibly can to you. But I promise I will not run over you. You guys already know where this is going, and I should have seen where it was going. But like any good sidekick, you know, in my childhood and innocence, I trusted him, and I took Evel Knievel's orders, and I laid down on the driveway, and I waited to hear the whoosh of his bike tires drive past me. But instead, I heard the laugh of a diabolical 7-year-old and the thud of the tires that drove directly over my house. And I had been betrayed. And I ran inside screaming to my mother, saying, my traitor of a brother, and he was the scar to my Mufasa. I had tire tracks across my stomach. And I said, this man has betrayed me. I was a kindergarten victim of a hit and run. It was ridiculous. I had been betrayed. And I look back and I laugh on that now, and it is kind of funny. But I also know that those tears that I cried that day weren't just because I was in physical pain. It was because of the sting of betrayal by my dearest friend and my closest playmate who said that he would keep me from harm. What do you do when you have been betrayed? As we walk through some of the different Jesus encounters this semester in the book of Luke, we've seen a lot of different stories. We've seen the story of the rich young ruler and who or what we find our identity in. We have seen the story of forgiveness and of freedom in the sinful woman. We've seen the story of the centurion that Matthew brought, and meeting and loving our neighbors in faith. We've seen the story of Zacchaeus that Claudia talked about last week, and finding people of peace. But this week is kind of a hard one. This week, the Jesus encounter that we are talking about is the story of the upper room. It's the story of Judas Iscariot and of the most famous betrayal in all of history. This story opens up in Luke chapter 22, so if you have your Bibles or devices and you want to get them out and follow along, you can do that. The text will also be on the screen. But in Luke chapter 22, it opens in verse 1, and it says this. The festival of unleavened bread, which is also called Passover, was approaching. The leading priests and the teachers of religious law were plotting how to kill Jesus, but they were afraid of the people's reaction. Then Satan entered into Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12 disciples. And he went to the leading priests and the captains of the temple guard to discuss the best way to betray Jesus to them. They were delighted, and they promised to give him money. So he agreed, and he began looking for an opportunity to betray Jesus so he could arrest him when the crowds weren't around. That's where we're pausing. Now, the scene opens up in Passover time. Passover was a really big deal to Jewish people. It was pretty much the biggest deal. And because it held such significance in the history of the Jewish people, thousands and thousands of them would come back to the city of Jerusalem to be there for this holy festival. It was kind of like Lollapalooza for the Jews. But because it was so crowded and because so many of the people there did love and admire Jesus, the corrupt religious leaders were kind of afraid of how the people would react, because they hated Jesus, but they were afraid of how the people would react if Jesus were to be publicly arrested in a big scene in the middle of Passover. The people might riot out of control, and that would completely foil their plans because they wanted to kill Jesus. So when Judas, who was an insider, as one of the 12, approached them with an offer to help, our text said that they were delighted, and they slapped a price on it, 30 silver coins to be exact. That's kind of like pawning off your best friend to an assassin for a bag of Chuck E. Cheese tokens. And as I read this, and as I studied it, that part in particular, it made my stomach churn. How could you be delighted? How could you be so evil that you would commit the most heinous crime on the holiest week of the year against a man who spent his life helping people? And you would betray your best friend for 30 silver coins? Really, Judas? Perhaps to understand the gravity of Judas's actions, we need to really understand what betrayal is. See, betrayal is more than just getting tricked or getting your feelings hurt. Betrayal is really only something that a friend or a loved one can do, because it requires you to have someone's trust and loyalty first. An enemy can attack you. Your competition might deceive you. Any old person could plan for your destruction. But betrayal is when it's done by someone who said that they would support you. Rejection might cause a wound, but betrayal pours salt in it to make it sting. Failure might knock you off of your feet, but betrayal kicks you while you're down. Criticism and insult might hurt your pride, but betrayal breaks your heart. And I'm not so naive to think that many of you in this room haven't yourselves been touched by real betrayal. By a mother or a father who walked out on your family or out on your marriage. By a friend who betrayed your trust by telling a secret that you told them in confidence or by spreading a rumor. By a significant other who said, "You're the only one for me," until you found out that there was another one. For some of you, betrayal has left some very real scars in your story. And when you read this passage, maybe your first thought is, "Oh, I have Judas. I know exactly who has betrayed me." And some of you are holding on to that anger and that hurt that betrayal has left. Some of you have grown calloused and you think, "I'm fine. I don't care. They can't hurt me anymore." But the truth is that if I put a stethoscope to your heart in the middle of the night when it's just you and your thoughts, you're really not okay. Betrayal hurts, but Jesus knows that. I read an interview recently with Oprah Winfrey. And I don't know how you guys feel about Oprah, if you like her, you don't like her, whatever. But regardless, she has been a pioneer and hugely shaping influence in the world of journalism, women's rights, children's rights, racial equality, education, and media platforms of all kinds. She is very decorated. She's been given Emmy Awards, she's been given Producers Awards, awards from the NAACP, humanitarian awards of every single kind, and by all accounts, she is a hugely successful and influential person. But she did not start that way. And in the interview that I was reading this week, she was asked what her greatest accomplishment was, and all of these wonderful things that she's done. What is her greatest accomplishment? And she didn't even mention any of those awards. The first thing she said without hesitation was that her greatest accomplishment was a school that she founded in South Africa called the Oprah Winfrey Academy of Leadership for Girls. And when asked, why is that your greatest accomplishment and not one of these prestigious accolades that you have? She said that it's because she sees her own story in the girls that attend that school. See, Oprah was not born into wealth and into fame, and certainly not into a healthy family. Oprah Winfrey was born in rural Mississippi to a single mother who was a housemaid, and she was so poor that she wore dresses made of potato sacks. By the time she was 9 years old, she was being sexually abused by multiple people in her family. By the time she was 14, she was pregnant with her first child, who she gave birth to and then died in infancy. And her life was full of hardship and pain and poverty until she was offered the opportunity to go to a better school in a different state. And
And because she was given a better education, because she was moved into a safer environment, her story did change. But she's never forgotten where she came from. And most of the girls who go to that school that she founded in South Africa, their stories have come from brokenness and despair as hers once was. But this now famous and wealthy and successful woman can bend down and look into the eyes of those girls and say truthfully, I get it. I know where you've been. I know how this feels. Oprah isn't Jesus, not even close. But Jesus can bend down and he can look at us in our eyes and say, I know, I get it. I've been where you've been. Jesus was not some kind of emotionally exempt Superman who didn't feel pain. He gets the hurt of betrayal. He knows what it's like when someone turns their back on you, and it broke his heart too. And if Jesus knows what it's like to be where we've been, maybe we can learn to do what he did. What do you do when you have been betrayed? As our passage moves on, the scene turns in the next 14 verses from Judas's interaction with the religious leaders in Jerusalem to Jesus and his disciples, Judas included, and they're sitting in an upper room of a house and they are sharing the customary Passover meal as a family together. And in that meal, which we call the Last Supper, Jesus takes bread and he breaks it. And he takes wine, pours it out, and he shares it. And he says, "This is my body and my blood, which is poured out as a sacrifice for you." Now, Leonardo da Vinci has one of the most admired and famous paintings in the world, and it is of this very scene. It's on the screens here. And when we look at it, we see an upper room in the city of Jerusalem, merely hours before his crucifixion, where Jesus sat with his disciples, and they ate together. But as they ate the bread and as they drank the wine, Jesus continued to speak. And in chapter 22 and verse 21, he says, "But here at this table, sitting among us as a friend, is the man who will betray me. For it has been determined that the Son of Man must die, but what sorrow awaits the one who betrays him?" The disciples began to ask each other which of them would ever do such a thing. See, this was a really shocking statement to them. Jesus had been saying for a while that he was going to die, but to be killed by betrayal by one of his own friends, these were like Jesus' dudes. They lived their lives and they left their families so that they could follow him and learn from them, and they would be the last people to betray him. Da Vinci's painting captures this moment when Jesus says this, and the disciples begin to ask among them which one of them would possibly betray Jesus. And when we look at this story, when we look at this painting, perhaps we want to identify with Jesus. We want to say, we are the betrayed. But when I look at this story, when I search my heart, when I look at this painting, I find that my face does not belong where Jesus is. My face belongs where Judas is, and in my own hands are the bag of silver. And I think our question shifts. What do you do when you are the betrayer? We've all sinned. We've all fallen short of the glory of God. And truth be told, we've all sold Jesus out. We betray his trust when we try to take control of our own lives. We betray his goodness when we choose to speak nasty words or we think unholy thoughts about another person. We choose to betray his joy when we compare our lives to someone else's and forget to live in gratitude. We betray his mercy when we are too stubborn to forgive. We think Judas was a dirtbag for selling Jesus out for 30 pieces of silver, but we've sold him out for less than that. We sell him out to get a grade by cheating, for 10 minutes of pleasure without commitment, for a laugh at the expense of someone's dignity, for withholding our resources from the needy so we can buy what we want without thinking about it, for looking at another website that you know you really shouldn't, for the satisfaction of a well-crafted insult, for the comfortability of excusing yourself from kindness to someone that you think is annoying or beneath you. We've sold him out. What do you do when you are the betrayer? Judas ate the bread and he drank the wine, but then he left the table. And later that night, when he handed Jesus off to the authorities, he sealed it with a kiss. How often has that been our story? When you get up and you go to church and you volunteer and you tell people that you follow Jesus, you tell Jesus that you want to follow him. You say, I love you. I'd do anything for you. I will wear your name and I will learn your ways. But then you turn your back and you walk away from the table. We are the betrayers. We are Judas. But do you know what comes next in this story? Judas's kiss of betrayal led to an arrest, and the arrest led to a trial, and the trial led to a beating, and the beating led to a cross where the Son of God cried out, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And that prayer was not just a prayer for the men who were driving nails into Jesus' hands. That was a prayer for Judas. That was a prayer for you. That was a prayer for me. When he was on the cross, we were on his mind. And he said of his betrayers, forgive them. And that cross led to a death. And that death led to a grave. And the grave lay still for 1 day, for 2 days. But on that third day, that grave gave way for a resurrection that has transformed the world and our lives for good. And oh, what good news that is, that when our betrayal meets the cross, it is redeemed. But betrayal is messy. And the story of Judas doesn't just have a happy ending that I can wrap up in a bow and deliver to you without heartache. See, after Judas betrayed Jesus, he realized what he'd done. And unable to cope with the weight of his own sin, he made the one decision that he could go back on, and he committed suicide, and he hanged himself. Judas only came to the table once, and he left, and he never came back. But Judas was not the only disciple that betrayed Jesus that night. At that same dinner, Simon Peter, who was one of Jesus' dearly loved disciples, was also there. And that night at the dinner table, Jesus also predicted that Simon Peter, would deny Jesus 3 times before the rooster crowed the next morning. And Peter said, never! I would never do that. But sure enough, as Jesus awaited his trial, Peter stood out in the courtyard, and he warmed his hands by a fire, and 3 times he was asked, do you know Jesus? And 3 times he denied him, and he betrayed his relationship with his Lord. And as the rooster crowed, he realized what he'd done, and he wept. But Peter's story doesn't end the same way that Judas's did. Instead of taking drastic and life-ending measures like Judas, Peter did the only thing he knew how to do before Jesus. He went fishing. And after the death of a man who he loved best but had denied and betrayed, he cast his nets over the side of a boat, but he peered out, and on the shore he saw his risen Lord cooking breakfast. And do you know what Peter did? He came back to the table. And over a shared meal, 3 times Jesus asked Peter, do you love me? And 3 times Peter said, you know that I love you. And he knew that on the cross, his betrayal had been forgiven, and that at the table, it had been reconciled. Our story starts like Judas's. We have betrayed Jesus. We have sold him out. We have turned our back, and we have walked away from the table. But Jesus died for Judas too. And Judas' story wouldn't have had to end that way, because Christ's sacrifice is so great that his death and his resurrection forgives every sin, even the most bitter of betrayals. Don't let your story end like Judas's, who left the table and never saw Jesus again this side of eternity. Instead, be like Simon Peter. Jesus went to the cross so that we could come back to the table. When betrayal meets the cross, it is redeemed. When it comes to the table, it is reconciled. Garrison Keillor is one of my very favorite storytellers. He's fascinating. And in one of his books, he writes a story about a church that split over a very small doctrinal issue, but it was a bitter dispute between the 2 factions of the church. And he tells of this man who he calls Uncle Al. And Uncle Al really wanted to try to make peace between these 2 factions of the church. And these 2 factions were led by Brother Miller and Brother Johnson. And these men had grown up together. They had been friends their whole lives, but they felt as though they had been betrayed by the other. So Uncle Al called a meeting to address these problems, but he called it on a Sunday afternoon at Aunt Flo's house over a plate of her famous fried chicken. And I just want to read this to you guys because he tells the story so well. He says, "They all arrived one Sunday for Aunt Flo's famous fried chicken. They came in their Fords, being united only on the fact that Ford was better than Chevy. These men were gaunt, flinty-eyed, thin-lipped, in dark floppy suits, and they brought with them their plump, obedient wives. They sat at the table. But the grace before the meal posed a problem, because these church members were sometimes known to seize prayer and use it like a sermon to beat other people over the head with it. So Uncle Al, in his wisdom, had everybody pray silently so they couldn't pray imprecatory prayers over one another. And it seemed like an excellent idea, except that then it turned into a contest to see who could pray the longest. Brother Miller would sneak a glance at Brother Johnson, no signs of surfacing. Brother Johnson was deeply engaged with God, who of course agreed with him on so many levels. So Brother Miller dove back down for some more prayer too. No one would come up for air, because it might look as though they wanted to eat more than they wanted to pray. It was becoming the longest table grace in history, and it went on and on and on and on until Aunt Flo, smart woman, slid her chair back and she rose, and she went to the kitchen, and she brought out the food that they were both competing to see who could be the most thankful for. She set that hay down where the goats could get it, and tears streamed down Brother Johnson's face, and so was Brother Miller weeping. And it's true what they say, that smell is the key that unlocks our deepest memories. And with their eyes closed, the smell of that fried chicken and that gravy made those men into boys again. It was years ago that they were fighting, and a mother's voice from on high said, "Now you two stop it, get in here and have your dinner now, I mean it." That blessed cornmeal crust and rapturous gravy brought the memory to mind, and the stony hearts of those two giants melted, and they raised their heads, and they filled their plates, and they slowly made peace at that table over glorious chicken. The table is where the betrayed and the betrayer are reconciled. Our question, what do you do when you have been betrayed, is answered by our question of, what was done for us when we were the betrayers? We forgive. Jesus invited Judas and Peter to the table knowing that they would betray him. But he invited them anyway. He knows that we have betrayed him. He knows that there will still be times when we don't get it right. He says, though, that we are forgiven, and he invites us back to be reconciled to him and to others. When betrayal meets the cross, it is redeemed, and when it comes to the table, it is reconciled. Who do you need to bring to the table? Betrayal has caused deep wounds in some of your lives, more than just getting run over by a bicycle. I know that sometimes it feels like betrayal is too much for you to forgive, or for some of you, maybe you just think it's not even worth trying. But the Lord's Prayer says, "Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who have sinned against us." We have to learn to be humbled and remember that first we betrayed God, and he took it to the cross. One of my favorite songs is called "How Deep the Father's Love for Us," and it is so convicting to me every time. It says this: "Behold the man upon a cross, my sin upon his shoulders. Ashamed, I hear my mocking voice call out among the scoffers. It was my sin, it was my betrayal that held him there until it was accomplished. His dying breath has brought me life. I know that it is finished." But the song doesn't end there, and neither does the story. "And while we were still sinners, the Son of God died for us." What kind of love does that? And can it not give us the power to do the same? Not because we're good enough to love and forgive others on our own, but because Christ first loved and forgave us. The song goes on and it says, "I will not boast in anything. No gifts, no power, no wisdom. But I will boast in Jesus Christ, his death and resurrection. Why should I give him his reward? I cannot give an answer. But this I know with all my heart, his wounds have paid my ransom. By his wounds we are healed. By his cross our betrayal is redeemed, and at his table, we are reconciled. And tonight, in this upper room, you are going to get the opportunity to come back to the table. We're going to break bread and we're going to drink juice of the Lord's Supper together, but we're also going to come face to face with the betrayal in our own lives. For our betrayal against God, we will repent and we will accept the redemption and the forgiveness that came by the cross. And for the betrayal in our own relationships, we will respond with reconciliation that comes at his table. Alec is going to tell you some more about this, and he's going to lead us in